There is 1 day to go before Masters Bangkok starts, and so we're gonna do a little pick'em. Here are the teams, here are the games that will be played in the first round of the Swiss stage. And what we're gonna do for this pick'em is kind of go a bit more in depth. We're gonna take a look at some of the stats for the teams, you know, what maps they like to play, try and actually predict where the map veto will go, and therefore who is likely to win based upon that. And eventually, obviously, we'll pick who we think will go through the Swiss stage, and then, of course, who I think will win the tournament overall. So let's dive into the games. And our first game is actually EDG versus Team Liquid. So as I said, we are going to take a bit more of a stat look at this today. And so here are some things you might want to know about Team Liquid and how they're doing in general, right? Like, so here you've got their maps, right? How many times they played those maps, how many they won, their attack win rate, their defensive win rate, my rating for them, which in some cases is based only off one map. So, you know, it's not going to be perfect, that for sure. You can see what maps they picked and banned here in their time during kickoff, and their 3 last games as well that they played here on the right-hand side. So, with that said, let's talk about this game, Team Liquid versus EDG. And let's start off by talking about the map veto, right? So Liquid, you can see, have banned Lotus the most, right? That has been kind of their ban, but most recently, you might remember, they have been playing Lotus with their very strange comp that, you know, they destroyed Team Heretics with, but then lost against Vitality. And I do think that that comp has kind of seen its best days. However, in those games, they had been banning Pearl. Right, so you can see in their last 2 games where they had a ban, obviously they didn't have one in the grand final, they had banned Pearl twice before. So what that probably tells you is that, you know, when you look at their Pearl, they hadn't won on Pearl in the 3 times they played it before, so, you know, it makes sense that they would probably stick with getting rid of Pearl. EDG, they've been banning Abyss a lot, essentially. That's kind of been just, you know, for the most part, what they've been banning. Although they did win Abyss against Trace, that crazy 16-14, nobody going absolutely insane. You know, they essentially won that game because nobody went insane, and if he didn't, they definitely would have lost on Abyss. So I don't really know too much what to think about that. And I think banning Abyss against Team Liquid probably makes a lot of sense. It's honestly probably Liquid's best map as well. So if you're EDG, it probably does just make sense to just stick with banning Abyss. Liquid have had a Abyss ban, so they can't go there. They've won every time they've played 2 other maps, which is Haven and Split. Now, Haven, as you might well know, is a map that EDG have a 97% attack win rate on. They've won 2 13-0s on Haven. So I kind of doubt they'll go there, and I think that Split, EDG have only played it once. They did win that game, but they have only played it once. So I think Liquid picking Split probably makes sense for them. And I think if you're EDG, again, Haven is a map, of course, that you're feeling extremely confident about, but Liquid are also pretty good at Haven. So I would probably say to EDG that Fracture actually makes more sense. That's a map that Team Liquid have played 5 times. They've only won 2 of those 5. So I do think that Fracture probably makes sense for EDG there as well. And then I do think that Haven map 3 just kind of makes sense. And if we'd had this as our map pool, Split, Fracture, Haven, I would say that Split is maybe slightly Liquid favored, but I would say like 45, 55 maybe to Team Liquid. I think that Fracture would be pretty heavy favored EDG, like 75, 25. And I would probably just give the edge to EDG here on Haven, like 55-45. So with that said, overall, I guess I am saying that the winners, to me, would be EDG. So going through the same process here with DRX and Sen, let's talk about what map they will ban first. And Pearl has become kind of a common ban here in the last couple of games for DRX, and it's a map that they played once and lost and then started banning a bit. So they could ban Pearl, but you can see that they have actually been banning quite a few different maps. And so if they are basing it off of their opponent more so, then they could look to ban a map like Split. Sentinels Pearl is still okay though, and so I do think it's most likely that DRX get rid of Pearl. Let's talk about Sen's ban first of all, because Sen have 2 kind of maps here in Fracture and Haven. They're in their grand final against G2. Both maps they didn't look great on, if we're being honest. I think if you're playing DRX and if you're Sentinels, you'd probably want to ban Fracture over Haven. Their Fracture, I think, is probably DRX's best map, so that lines up quite nicely for Sen to just get rid of Fracture instead. Now, DRX, in terms of picking, they could pick Haven, but Abyss is also a pretty good map for them. It's one that is decent for Sentinels, so there's a couple places that they could go. They could go Haven, they could go Abyss. I have this weird feeling that they will go Abyss. I feel like DRX are probably going to play it a bit safe here. And for Sen, if Pearl does get banned, I think Split is absolutely their pick. And then in terms of what would get banned, I think here if you're DRX, Lotus would probably be your ban. That's been a map that hasn't been that convincing for them so far, so that would make sense for them. And then I think Sen, with the choice of Bind or Haven, would almost certainly get rid of Haven. Even if they had put some prep into it, I think that makes sense, unless they really like their prep. And so we'd probably end up with map 3 here on Bind. And this is where this gets tough, right? Because if this was the map pool, I would probably say, like, okay, Abyss is maybe, you know, slightly DRX favored, like a 55-45. You know, Split is maybe like a Sen 60-40, something like that. And then Bind, both teams are kind of okay at Bind. So this would probably be like a pure 50-50. And this is why this game gets so difficult. I think overall, though, I am just going to ever so slightly favor Sentinels. So let's lock in Sentinels as the pick, and our next game is Team Vitality versus T1. So let's start then with T1, and the bans in this game are pretty easy, right? Like, T1 have been banning Abyss, they were forced to play against the RX, it looked awful, they're gonna ban Abyss, and Team Vitality have just been banning Pearl. The only time they banned another map was when they had a double ban, and Pearl is one of T1's better maps, so the bans are pretty simple in this one. It should be Abyss and Pearl gone. Which would leave us with this map pool instead. Now, where we go from here would be interesting, right? We could go to Lotus. That is another, you know, a map that T1 have been winning on recently. And Team Vitality have only played once, but they looked, you know, fairly formidable on that map. It looked like a good performance, but it is only one game. Probably, I would guess Lotus, because, I mean, you look at the win rates here for a lot of the maps from T1. You know, it's not great, right? It really isn't that great. So I'm just gonna say that they pick Lotus here, T1. And for Team Vitality, there is a lot more options in terms of places that they could go. Haven as a map is probably one that I think that they just feel confident on. Even though they got destroyed by Team Liquid, I think they'll learn from that. And I just think that Haven is probably a map that they feel pretty good about and that they'll just pick, to be honest, against T1 there. So yeah, I'm gonna go Haven. Both teams actually play the Fnatic Yoru ISO comp on that map as well. We then would go to the second round of bans, and I think if you're T1 here, you probably won't get rid of Bind. They've been kind of willing to play Bind quite a lot. Fracture is definitely one that they could get rid of, but I think actually Split is probably the more likely that they get rid of. So let's get rid of that for T1, and we'd have a choice of Bind or Fracture for Vitality. And really, they could go to either way. I don't think this is necessarily a big deal for them, but let's just say that they do go for Bind here, and we end up with this map pool instead with Bind, Haven, and Lotus. And here again, I mean, I'm probably actually favoring Vitality maybe on every single map. Again, maybe Lotus is more of like a 55-45, maybe even a 50-50, but Haven I would put more as kind of like a 70-30, and Bind probably, again, kind of a close one, but, you know, probably slightly leaning like a 55-45 towards Vitality again. So my pick is going to be, no surprise to you here, I'm going to go Vitality. So let's lock that in and come to our final game, which is G2 versus Trace. So let's start with Trace, and there's some interesting things going on here with Trace, because again, they have mixed up their bans a little bit here, and they also haven't played Split, but actually they've only banned Split once. This was kind of just like something that, you know, it just so happened they didn't play. So even though they haven't played it, it's not like necessarily they definitely won't play it. However, given their one performance on Fracture, you know, versus EDG, that would look really bad for them. So that's not great. Their Haven also as well is a map that I think they might want to get rid of. They lost to Billy. Against G2, obviously, there's a ton of good maps for them. So let's say that they do just get rid of Haven just here. And for G2, they mostly had been banning Lotus a couple times, but again, they're kind of banning for opponent, not necessarily banning anything. They kind of have the same situation here with Bind, where they've actually only banned it once, but it just so happens to have not necessarily come up. I mean, Lotus is probably Trace's best map, so getting rid of Lotus probably makes the most sense, I think, for G2. In terms of picking maps here, Trace then, if Lotus does get banned, would be in a bit of a rough spot, but Bind is a map that I think they're pretty confident in going to, and it's a map that G2 haven't played yet, so they might just hope that G2, you know, aren't that good at that map and pick Bind. And I think if you're G2, the pick is pretty simple. You're just gonna pick Pearl. Even though it's not necessarily a terrible map for Trace either, I think they'll just trust that their Pearl is just too good for anyone else. I think Fracture would probably be staring them at the face, and, you know, they would not feel too great about that. And I think if you're G2, the option would be pretty simple as well. You're going to get rid of Split instead of Abyss, and you're going to be happy to go to Abyss. And so we would end up with Bind, Pearl, Abyss, which I think if we did end up with this, even if I give Trace like a 50-50 on this map, I think Pearl and Abyss would be heavy favored here, like 70-30 on both of those, if not more, towards G2. So yeah, I'm going to pick G2. Okay, so here are the 4 games that I've picked then, and yeah, if you're asking me which one the most likely to be an upset is, this is obviously a bit of a 50-50, but out of the other 3, probably Liquid actually I think would have the best chance of winning that one. And then talking about like which teams do I think will make it through to the playoffs, I think G2 is pretty obvious, right? I also think I'm going to go with EDG. Then it does get a bit more tricky though, and a part of me really wants to pick a little bit of an upset here and go for something a bit strange. So I'm gonna say that my surprise team to make it through is gonna be Team Liquid. And I'm actually also going to pick Sentinels to go through. And there's always gonna be a surprise, if not 2 surprises. And so I'm gonna say that, you know, these 2, I mean, Sentinel less of a surprise, but Team Liquid, I'm gonna say will be the surprise pick. I'm gonna say that they go through. And then the question, of course, becomes, who do I think will win from there? Well, I've got these 4 teams going through, so here's how I'm going to place them. I'm going to say that Team Liquid will come 4th, Sentinels will come 3rd, and G2 will come 2nd, and EDG will win the tournament. Now, I don't think I have ever actually predicted a tournament correct at the start or before the tournament starts, right? Once we've got the playoffs, I think I've got it right, but not necessarily before the tournament starts. So EDG fans, I'm terribly sorry.